Let's go live, sir. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our last performance funding work group, edition number 2, I guess. We are way long in the tooth on a lot of information, but also feel long in the tooth on the year 2020. I want to say, first of all, I appreciate everybody for attending. I appreciate the kind of conversations we've been able to have. I appreciate really the collegiality that has helped us to get to a point where I think we've got a couple items that we can look at to come to a conclusion on an approval to get ready for the legislature that's coming up fairly soon. I also will tell you that today we will be discussing, I think, what I consider to be a reasonable proposal. We have an addendum to that we'll need to get you to vote on. I think 1 or 2 of the presidents, Ashish, I'm not sure if you want to add anything to the conversation based on the email you sent me, but we should be able to get to a place fairly soon. Bill has ran a few items that he will go over in a few minutes, but there may be some other items you want to run. But by the end of today, we hope to have a resolution we will vote on and come to consensus on. Even if we can't fully agree on it, we can live with it to move forward to the next 3 years, I guess, if we are going to look at it then. Also, I will tell you that we sent you a few things that I'll talk about in a few seconds after Heather calls the roll.
All right. Get my list here. President Thompson.
Here.
Budget Director Hicks.
Here.
Senator Givens.
Here.
Representative Tipton. President McFadden.
Here.
President Brown.
Here.
Beverly, I'll put you in. President Zarapata.
I'm here.
President Morgan.
I'm here as well.
President Jackson.
Here.
President Baivia.
Here.
President Capilouto.
Here.
President Bendapudi.
Rick Rysarek for President Bendapudi.
Thank you. President Caboni.
I'm here.
Wonderful. Have a great meeting.
Thank you, Heather. So you have in your packet, either the last time or this time, a letter from Pritchard that is writing in support of the performance funding work group. They believe that is working well. They've asked us, even though we won't get to all of it this time, to double down on the items that seem to be working well around the issue of equity. But you have that in your, I know you've read it already, but we wanted to send it back out to you. You have the general fund floor proposal. That's what we're calling it now until we come up with a better name. And you also have an addendum that's in red we sent to you last night that was proposed by Budget Director Hicks and was actually several of the presidents I've talked with also like that. So we're going to talk about next steps, and then hopefully we get to an adjournment. I'll get it out sooner or later before the 2 hours is up. I also need to tell you I'll have to jump off at 9:15 to jump on my other board meeting that's going on right now at Kentucky Board of Education. And I'll be back on after that. It shouldn't be any more than 15 minutes. With that in mind, do you have any questions before I'll turn it over to Bill? Bill, why don't you get us going? You have to unmute yourself, sir.
Okay, thank you, President Thompson. Good morning, everyone. Heather, if you wouldn't mind, can you put that written description of the general fund floor proposal on the screen? And I'm operating under the assumption, of course, that everyone has read this. maybe with the exception of the modification that starts on the bottom of page 2, which is in red font. We actually sent that out last night, and we apologize for getting that out so late. That was a late addition in terms of that possible modification. Yeah. Okay, so these are the basic points that are in the general fund floor proposal that was put on the table at the November 20th work group meeting. And as you may recall, it was basically that there would be a general fund appropriation floor established for each of the post-secondary institutions that would be equal to the current year adjusted net general fund appropriation. In that second bullet, we define what the adjusted net general fund appropriation is comprised of. It's each institution's regular appropriation in the current year, minus debt service, minus mandated programs, but it also includes the FY21 distribution from the performance fund. And so that's how we're defining the general fund floor. As you can see in parentheses in the first bullet, we're referring to that as the floor 21. That was what was put on the table at the last work group meeting. In addition to that, in that third bullet, the institutions would provide no stop loss contributions next year or possibly over the next several years. So all funding in that performance fund would be provided by the General Assembly if that's the case. CPE would utilize the existing funding model with no changes to distribute any funding that is appropriated by the General Assembly to the performance fund. And this is important, this next bullet, the funds would be distributed on a non-recurring basis. So if an institution in any given year earns some share of the funding that's in that performance fund, those are non-recurring funds, and the dollars would then be recurring in the next year back to the performance fund. I do have a question about this next bullet. CPE will reconvene the working group in 2022 and submit a report with recommendations by December 1st, 2023. I'm thinking that should say that we will reconvene the working group in 2023. If we're going to stick to that 3-year cycle that's in statute, this is 2020, so 21, 22, 23 would be the year that we would meet, and that makes sense given that the recommendations would be made by December 1st of that year. So that's, maybe one potential change that I might suggest to the working group. Other considerations, it's important that, the folks on this call understand that at least 2 of our universities and probably 3, maybe 4 of our community colleges very likely would not receive any distributions over the next 2 or 3 years. Those that have significant fiscal cliffs that they're facing, like KSU and Moorhead, they would likely not receive any of those non-recurring distributions from the fund. However, what they are guaranteed is that they would receive their general fund floor unless there is a budget reduction. And because we're doing away with that 2% or 1% stop loss contribution, those are funds that they will not be contributing to the performance fund. And so they would get to retain their general fund floor. Next page, Heather. Obviously, we would like to see the mandated program appropriations continue to be line item in the budget bill, the description of the program and the line item amounts. That next bullet is very important. Obviously, the General Assembly is not going to be constrained by the general fund floor in the event that a budget reduction is necessary. But the remainder of that bullet is very important because it basically says maintaining that floor will be the priority for the General Assembly. If a budget reduction were necessary, the funding would be taken out of the performance fund first. If there was a need to reduce the general fund floor, at such time as the General Assembly would then provide additional funding back to post-secondary education, restoring that floor would take priority over putting new funds in the performance fund. This next bullet, I think, is very important to a number of our institutions. There will be no base redistribution among institutions over the next several years. Lastly, under observations and comments, Heather, it does address the fiscal cliff at 3 universities and 6 community and technical colleges for the next 3 years. It does not eliminate the fiscal cliff, but it keeps those institutions from losing stop-loss contributions over the next several years and helps them maintain their floor. So in a way, it just postpones that cliff. It's possible that that cliff could be reduced through the distribution of funds appropriated by the General Assembly or improved performance at those campuses. The last thing I think I want to point out is that last bullet under observations and comments, and that is that simply maintaining the general fund floor over time does not help support inflationary cost increases, and it doesn't support growth and student success outcomes at our institutions. And so having those additional funds provided by the General Assembly is of paramount importance. Lastly, in red font, this is a proposal, as President Thompson indicated, that was submitted by State Budget Director Hicks. And he basically is proposing that rather than having all of the performance earnings being returned to the performance fund on a in other words, instead of the funds being totally non-recurring to the institutions and all of those funds being returned to the performance fund, is there a way that there could be an adjustment that would allow a portion of those funds earned to be retained by institutions that have a lower general fund per FTE compared to their peers? The actual mechanics of how we would do that have not been determined yet. But this would help close that equity gap between some institutions, for example, Northern and Western among the comprehensive institutions and several of the other comprehensive institutions. And I'll let State Budget Director Hicks provide additional details about that recommended modification. But at any rate, that's the proposal that's on the table. And I think I'll turn it back over to you, President Thompson, to lead the discussion among the work group members.
Bill, I'm not sure Aaron's back yet.
Yeah, I think you had to leave.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll open it up to the work group members to weigh in and let us know what you think about the proposal that was first suggested at the November 20th meeting, and you now have had a chance to see it in writing. And let's get some feedback from this group.
Bill, this is Bob Jackson. I would say this, and I've talked to some of my colleagues yesterday and last night. You know, nothing that any of us are going to do in 2020 is perfect, but this proposed plan is very good. It protects the institutions. That was our goal when we started out. I applaud Senator Givens, his recommendation in regard to getting us to this point. And, you know, I think this is an excellent proposal to advance. The comments from last night, while I haven't had a lot of time to review them, I think there is a great case to be made that over a period of time, maybe a couple of years, that some of the funds that would be earned through the model would be added to the base, 50%, whatever is negotiated. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to that point today for recommendation to the General Assembly. I'm also, I don't understand the FTE equity component. I think if we get into this broader discussion, we have to look at a total public funds discussion. Some of us have very low tuition on a gross basis, and some of us have a much higher tuition on a gross basis. And so when you get into the discussing, you know, general funds and FTE, I think there has to be a total public funds component discussion as a part of that. But I think the proposal is very good, and I would recommend that we move it forward.
Other presidents want to weigh in, other work group members?
Bill, this is John Hicks. I wanted to add in your description of the idea that I put forward was it was to maintain one of the goals of the formula of pursuing funding equity. You said that correctly. But more importantly, under the current funding formula and the hypotheticals you all put forward, including the KCTCS institutions, over 1/3 of the institutions would get no performance funding. And if the performance funding as its primary purpose is to incentivize behavior, right? More graduates, as everybody has near unanimously agreed to, then that's a weakness in the formula. So the notion that I put forward was to lower the barrier to those 8 institutions being able to achieve some of the performance funds with good performance. And so to me, that was the primary idea I had, was to try to address the weakness in the current formula, where only 2/3 of the institutions have a shot at additional funding.
Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification, State Budget Director Hicks. And, that was, I think, part of the impetus for the proposal that was put forth by Jackie Dudley, the Chief Budget Officer at Murray, and President Bob Jackson, about using that percent of formula share approach that we've already discussed at a previous meeting. If there were no new state funding and there was a stop loss contribution provided by the institutions, if you were to use that percent of share formula approach to distribute those dollars, every institution would get part of that distribution. And so that was part of the impetus for that proposal. And of course, several other presidents through President Jackson had suggested adding the hold harmless allocations in the current year to the small school adjustment at KSU, Moorhead, and Murray. KCTCS had recommended making a modification to their equity adjustment with a community needs index that would provide additional equity adjustment for certain institutions, primarily those 6 that were receiving no distribution in terms of the performance fund going to the 2-year colleges. And so that would have allowed, those institutions to have a better chance of earning, some of those funds if there were any new funding appropriated by the General Assembly, or if there were not, if you had a stop loss contribution, there would be a greater chance that those institutions would be able to earn those funds. And you're absolutely right, State Budget Director Hicks, that it's that fact that you're not at parity within the existing funding model that results in 2 or 3 of the universities and 6 community colleges being at the place where they're not receiving funding at this point. Once you achieve that funding parity, then there's much more likelihood going forward that those institutions would receive some level of distribution, particularly if there's new funding provided by the General Assembly. I'm going to stop there and let others sort of weigh in on the proposal for the general fund floor and the possible modification put forward by State Budget Director Hicks.
Bill, this is Eli. Could you define parity for me?
The way it was defined in the guiding principles when the first work group met and developed the funding model was to provide like funding for like activities. And of course, we do have that weighting between the research sector and the comprehensive sector. But what that really means is once that weighting is taken into account for every metric in the funding model, and let's just take bachelor's degrees, for example, for every weighted bachelor's degree produced, every institution will receive the same state subsidy per degree produced. And we, a year ago, we had 6 of our universities that were at funding parity, and only KSU and Moorhead were outliers that were not at funding parity with the others. And they actually had more funding per degree produced than the model would indicate. And that was the result of those hold harmless allocations that those institutions maintained in their base. Now we have 5 institutions, 5 universities at funding parity, and Murray State University is very close. But to answer your question, for every single metric in the funding model is providing the same level of state subsidy for student success outcome produced or for operational support activity metric.
Right, so the definition of parity is you get, quote, your fair share per degree. It focuses on student success. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
So this modification talks about general fund per FTE.
Right.
It's not about student success, is it?
Well, there is one metric in the funding model, as you know, the academic support metric, which is a 10% component of the total allocable resources that is distributed based on share of FTE. But you're correct. Most of the other metrics are student progression related, degree production related, earned credit hour related. And you could make the argument that earned credit hour component is somewhat similar to FTE because it is looking at credit hours. But whereas FTE, in the standard sense, when you're looking at funding per FTE, is credit hours attempted. In the funding model, we're looking at credit hours actually earned, and those credit hours are weighted for cost differences by degree level and by discipline. And so it's a much more sophisticated metric in my mind, the earned credit hour component, and that's a 35% component within the funding model. That's a more sophisticated measure of funding parity in my mind because it does take into account those cost differences by degree level and by discipline.
Yeah, I think it was in this week or last week's Wall Street Journal. It was the first analysis I'd seen of job disruptions by degree, by level of education during the pandemic. It not too surprisingly looked like what we saw in the 2008 recession. And I would say that a college degree, it didn't have, I don't think, a breakdown by 2-year degree, but a college degree compared to a high school degree offered great protection in terms of securing your job. And in fact, in the last recession, 2008, when we came out of that, I think 5 out of the 6 new jobs created were held by individuals who had degrees. So I just want to put that context, back in focus. This was about student success and your definition of parity in most components of the formula were focused on student success. And I appreciate the model being maintained. I think it maintains its integrity and durability to promote a sustained focus on student success. I worry that the modifications, get back to sort of enrollment. I agree that the degrees are, I would contend, mildly weighted in the formula. I think if you look historically across the country where weighted formulas have been used, the weights for professional and PhD programs are several times as great. And for us, to earn a $90 million Healing Communities grant is not just hiring faculty, it's having a robust doctoral program that, attracts all that new talent who want to participate in that sort of new frontier. So I have concerns about the possible modification in that it in a way neutralizes the focus on student success.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Payne,
President Capilouto.
Dr. Payne, this Jay Morgan. I wanted to comment on the general fund floor proposal, what I'll call the original Senator Givens proposal, and I appreciate the consistency that at least I'm reading in the language and also the tables that were provided. So from our perspective, I think that leans in a direction that the institution I represent fully supports and are appreciative of the consistency within it that it provides. I do want to go back to a question to Director Hicks, because I want to make sure I understand the language that is provided in red, particularly the second bullet. Director, would you mind, or Dr. Payne, would you mind providing some more clarity there? I'm having a little bit of trouble kind of encapsulating what the second bullet is trying to achieve when you talk about institutions with lower general fund per FTE retaining those dollars on a recurring basis. So could you help me a little bit there?
Let me interject. Those were, let's replace that with funding parity. The intention here was to not create a new, as President Capilouto asked Bill, what is funding parity, which we haven't talked very much about in this work group. That's the intention there. It wasn't intended to create a new metric. It was just to recognize that the student success at certain institutions is not being rewarded under a portion of the current formula. So, to respond to Dr. Capilouto, the intention here is to permit student success at all institutions to be rewarded, which currently is not.
And one way that could have been achieved, State Budget Director Hicks, and of course this is water under the bridge, but if there had been new funding provided for the model over the past 2 or 3 years, in all likelihood, we would have achieved that funding parity within the model itself, maybe with the exception of KSU in the university model and the exception of about 3 community colleges within the 2-year model. And so there's several ways you can get to that funding parity. One is you can take funding away from certain institutions and redistribute the base. And that's what's been happening in increments over the past 2 or 3 years through that stop loss contribution. But a way that would be preferable to many of the campus presidents on this call would have been if there had been new funding and you distribute those funds, that would allow you to close that funding parity gap and be at equity within the model. And then from that point forward, it would be just changes in performance that would drive how those funds are distributed. So I think that's a very important clarification. If you're saying that we're trying to let some of those institutions that are less well funded, given what they're producing, a way to keep some of those earnings, which going forward would help to continue to narrow that gap, then I understand that argument.
Bill, let me just interject on a couple of points I think that were made, including maybe responding to Bob Jackson's earlier point. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge and thank the folks here, including Senator Givens, for sort of initiating this conversation. I felt it was a major breakthrough in our approach, and given the time constraints and the challenges that all of us face, the core of the floor concept, I think, makes a lot of sense. It's clear, it's simple. It allows the model to work the way that it, I think, was made to, without creating these additional externalities that we were confronted with. So on the first piece of that, I think I want to acknowledge and endorse certainly the approach of putting that forward. I also appreciate the conversation that occurred at the last meeting when State Budget Director Hicks talked a little bit about parity, and we are now talking about a couple of different definitions, and I think we may not have all the time today to agree on what exactly that definition is and how it manifests itself in the model. But let me get back to the fundamental idea about state appropriations per FTE, and in response to the conversation today, including Bob Jackson's point, which I think is a good point, and that is not to simply look at the state appropriations, but look at the total public funding, which means also looking at the tuition per FTE. Bob, the only thing I would say in response to that is that while all of us have a commitment to keep our tuition rates affordable, perhaps the lack of the appropriate level, a base funding level of state appropriations for FTE may have caused some institutions. I'm not talking that that's always to in fact raise the tuition to get it up to what should be the par. But I would encourage, in fact, I just did some back of the envelope calculations myself that I've shared with Bill Payne about what the funding would be with state appropriations and also tuition. And that can certainly be elaborated for everyone. But at the core of the question is, what is the importance and significance of state appropriations per FTE? And in my, why is it that SHIO and so many other organizations all over, and Aaron Thompson knows that, I believe you're still on that board, he knows very well, what is the purpose and significance of state appropriation? There's no question about student success outcomes driving performance. There's not going to be any argument about, I think, from any of us on that front. But the state appropriations per FTE, whichever way you look at it, is the clearest indicator of the state's investment in that institution's operations. That is the support that the state is providing. You indicate that, you compare that across regions, across institutions, and so on. And so I don't think we should dismiss the idea of looking at state appropriations per FTE, or Bob Jackson's approach to say, let's take that and look at tuition per FTE. There's no question about each of those being, maybe all three of them take into account. But at the fundamental question, if we say, what is the Commonwealth's investment in Northern Kentucky University today? And what is the Commonwealth of Kentucky's investment in any of the other institutions today? That indicator is the clearest indicator of that level of investment. And of course, I will advocate for the fact that if NKU's investment by the Commonwealth of Kentucky is significantly lower than any of the other peer institutions, my question is, why is it that the Commonwealth of Kentucky is not investing in NKU to the same level as the other institutions? And I suspect, I don't want to put words in my colleague Tim's perspective, but he might have a similar argument. So I just want to be clear, while we are talking about two different things, I don't think they're really in conflict with each other. The performance fund and the formula, the model is to drive success in students, no question. The base funding and investment in an institution can be looked at by looking at the state appropriations per FTE. So I would really encourage us to think about that particular modification as a way to address that issue, as well as to keep driving the performance fund and new base funding, a new additional funding to drive student success performance.
Appreciate Ashish's comments, and in many ways, I agree. The initial intent of the performance funding model was really to get us to that parity in per FTE funding. We didn't ever get there, so we didn't meet that goal of the first iteration of the model. So in thinking about how it is you might take that into account, perhaps instead of setting, and this is just, I'm just throwing this out there, what if instead of setting a funding floor, you set a per FTE floor using those numbers? And that would say at some minimum, we expect the Commonwealth per student to fund our institutions accordingly. And then everything above that would be performance. I'm throwing that out there just as a discussion point or as an idea. But I have to agree with Ashish. There's an underinvestment that it was per student that's historical. And in many ways, it's about the success of Northern and WKU. And the inequity in funding is because we were successful and the dollars didn't flow the way we hoped they would. And so I appreciate, and you all know I believe in performance. I think at least our two institutions weren't rewarded for the performance they created. least in terms of their growth and success. But and I know some of that's water under the bridge, but I do want to throw that out there. Perhaps there's an FTE per FTE minimum funding, not necessarily in a total appropriation funding.
Tim,
Can I respond to President Caboni's comment? He's saying that we haven't seen the progress that he would have liked to seen, and maybe that President Badilla would have liked to see in terms of closing that gap as measured by the funding per FTE metric. But what we have seen is closing of that gap between Northern and Western and the other comprehensive institutions over this 3 to 4 year period. And that has occurred even though we had a 1% stop loss last year and a 2% stop loss this year. And so we haven't allowed the model to fully achieve the phase in that was anticipated. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, it would have helped if there had been some additional state appropriations, which would have helped to narrow that gap as well. And so that's one reason that the progress has been slow, is because we've only been distributing the 1% stop loss contribution, then a 2% stop loss contribution. And I know that institutions that were contributing that stop loss and receiving no distribution back obviously would not have wanted to see a 3 or 4% stop loss contribution, which would have accelerated reaching that funding parity. But that's the reason that progress has been slow, President Camboni, but we are making progress toward closing that gap. And the other thing you've got to consider is that the weighting in the funding model has a 0.5 for the earned credit hour component for out-of-state students versus 1 for in-state students. And that was a decision of the working group. If you look at that funding per FTE metric and you take the out-of-state student FTE and you weight it by 0.5, the gap closes even more. And so you're much closer to funding parity per FTE if you weight those out-of-state students at 50% of an in-state student.
Bill, what is the effect of creating that funding floor then? So one of the ways we were getting that parity really was through shifting resources among institutions. When you create the floor, that shift doesn't seem to occur. It only occurs through the performance, which I agree with performance. So that's one question I have. The other question is, wasn't there supposed to be an additional allocation to get Northern and Western up to that parity point?
Yes, you're correct on your second question. And there was an equity adjustment about 4 years ago. It was the second year, I believe, of the 16-18 biennium. But at any rate, Western received about $2.5 million and Northern received about $5 million. And that factored into that floor in that first year that we actually implemented the performance funding model. And in the first couple of years that the performance funding model was adopted, Northern and Western received even additional funding that was shifted in their direction as a result of implementing that model. So yes, there was an equity adjustment, and that became part of the base as we kicked off the performance funding model 4 years ago.
And President Camboni, that was the second version of an equity adjustment. There was one done some years prior.
Right.
Yeah, there was. Go ahead, Tim. Let me just jump in on a couple of things here. So I understand dealing with the FTE as a floor creates another big variable, obviously, that we'll have to figure out if that is the direction we want to go. A couple of points I want to make. Ashish is correct about where SHEO is at on this. It's looking at funding per FTE as it relates to the mission of each institution, as it relates to the opportunity for each institution to achieve their mission, is one of the ways that they look at a state supporting their higher education system. That's absolutely correct. One of the pieces, though, of measuring funding for FTE, I mean, there's a lot of pieces to that this group, if we go down that path, will have to define. I mean, whether it's, purely head count, attempted hours, FTE based on full-time equivalent at 12 or 15, a variety of things that you would have to look at to think about. The point that I will say, at least from a statewide perspective, now I'm talking about the guy that represents everybody, is that it is important that we think about one thing in order to get us where we want to go. And I think the floor helps us to think about that a whole lot clearer than we would have before. That is, will each institution have enough money to build a base to fulfill the mission of their student populations, whether it's in-state, out-of-state, whether it's low income, whether it's middle income, whether it's producing need-based scholarships, merit-based scholarships, and so on. So those come in to maybe a longer term discussion than we will have obviously today, but I think it is important that we think about that. I think John's addendum tries to address some of that to a degree. And although maybe not a perfect metric as we define FTE now, or nor that we want to go in that direction, I do believe we'll have to pay some attention to whether or not some base needs to be going to places that may not have as solid of a student support system. I'm not throwing rocks at anybody here, by the way, when I say this, but some institutions are better equipped to perform successfully with students than others. And in the past, several of our institutions, I'll use Jay Morgan since he's a good friend of mine, at Moorhead, losing pieces of his base on over and over again, did not allow him to build a solid of an infrastructure. I know he's going to tell you he has a perfect one already, but as solid of a student success infrastructure as he would need to be building. So if we look at only the student success outcomes, if we look at only the outcome measures, I think the question that's posing itself is, even with the floor, does it allow us to have a continuing build out of being able to perform at an equitable level? I don't like equalization at all because I don't know what that means, but at an equitable level to serve their students.
Aaron, I'll jump in on that because I think that what I was suggesting was not for this conversation, but I do think taking institutional mission to account as we move forward, I think is an important conversation for us to have. And I agree with you there. The per FTE would be for some future conversation, not today. And I want to throw clearly my support behind the proposal as it exists. I think that it's strong. It moves us in the right direction. In some ways, I do like the intellectual exercise continuing and talking about the model and thinking about what it actually does and why it does it and how it's performing. And I'd like to see those conversations continue. But I'm supportive of the proposal as it exists.
President Thompson, just so you're aware, we've heard from about half of the institutions in terms of the proposal and the modification, possible modification. We haven't heard from U of L, Eastern, KSU, or KCTCS. And then we may want to let Senator Givens and Representative Tipton weigh in at that point.
This is Beverly Schneller from Kentucky State. We are in favor of the general floor fund proposal as it's written. Also, I'm encouraged by what Budget Director Hicks has been talking about and the follow-up conversation as regards the amendments on the parity. Because I think it is important to find ways to demonstrate investment for those institutions that are growing and achieving as we are. And under the current model, because we started at a different point than others in the system, I think we would definitely benefit from that. And I would say that since this is a proposal, and as Budget Director Hicks indicated, bringing up the equity piece is a way of closing the loop on some of the conversation that had been held. It seems like it wouldn't be a bad idea to figure out, as you mentioned, Dr. Payne, how to implement it or how to operationalize it in a general way to see if it would be possible. As you mentioned in your presentation, that we didn't have the mechanisms for it fleshed out, and that would be important, of course, to see how it would work. But I think in principle, it would reward us and enable us to come a little closer as far as sustaining what we need for student success, because our reports do indicate that we have been growing, we've been meeting our targets, we've been exceeding some of our targets, but we haven't been able to fully gain the funding that we would find beneficial. So we are in favor of both of those things.
Yeah, thank you, Beverly. And I think that gets to some of what State Budget Director Hicks is trying to get us to focus on. We've had several institutions that are in the same boat as Kentucky State, where they've actually shown improvement, but it hasn't been reflected in the dollars that are being distributed. And so I think what the bottom line of what State Budget Director Hicks is proposing is, if an institution is producing more degrees, progressing more students, is showing improvement, that should be reflected in the distributions from the performance fund.
And to me, because this is a proposal, putting that concept out there to the people who will become the decision makers lets them think through that same process, just as you're talking about, and may open up windows to them, as some of the other presidents have mentioned, especially President Caboni most recently, about things that they should be thinking about. And so just the fact that we've been able to spin off some additional ideas from it, I think is an endorsement of the value of the presence of that conversation, as long as it doesn't derail the other stuff that you've been working on or change it in some way.
Okay, thank you. Rick Grassart from U of L, would you care to weigh in?
Sure. So thank you, Bill. Like I think everyone else on the call, we do support the general fund floor proposal. It does accomplish all the things that the existing model does in terms of encouraging performance for students. And I think there's a wide recognition that has really been successful so far. Just on the proposed modification, I think at least what I've kind of taken away from the conversation is that when you look at like the SHIO data, and the focus on state funding per FTE across a system or an individual university, I think that maybe part of that conversation should start looking into, does Kentucky sufficiently fund its public higher ed institutions? And maybe that's sort of the goal here. The underlying theme is kind of the overarching funding for all the universities in Kentucky. And I know you don't know this offhand, Bill, but I think it would be interesting if you were able to calculate, or anybody on CPE would calculate, what amount of additional funding would be necessary to bring Kentucky up to whatever benchmark we think is appropriate on that per funding per FTE model. So if Kentucky, for example, is, I'll make up a number, $1,000 per student below the region, how much additional state appropriation would it take to move the needle up to that level for Kentucky? And I think maybe that's where the angle should proceed, is not trying to carve out an FTE sort of component of the model, but figuring out what additional amount of state appropriations would be necessary to bring everybody up to that level. So,
I will just jump in and say Rick brings what I think SHIO would argue is the correct way of thinking about that. To be honest with you, we have to look also at, and I'll talk for Paul here, even though you have the ability to speak for yourself. When we look at that, we'll take community colleges as an example, that in most states, they have community inputs of dollars, which makes KCTCS look a whole lot different than other community colleges around the nation. So when we think of state appropriations, we will have to do that based on really the sectors. If we're really wanting to make understanding of this, such as UK and U of L as research institutions, that look somewhat different than others. So as we combine this conversation of FTE, as we combine all of our institutions, 4-year institutions in one pot, that throws it off a little bit too. But as Rick suggests, this conversation probably needs to take another angle of study to truly get what I think everybody's really wanting to get or wanting to look at. How well do we compare ourselves to other like institutions and other like states, if you will? the point that I will get to statewide, and I'll shut up with this point. Our goal in this 60 by 30 that we have, that we're using performance funding really to drive in many ways, tells us that we, even though we've gained, thank you all, by the way, we are closing that gap nationally with educational attainment. We've done really, really well in the last 3 years, last 2 years in particular. And so the idea that we should take that into consideration too, in addition to those benchmarking elements that fairly often are used to judge whether or not we're getting the correct state support. So I wanted to do that. Who's next, Bill? David McFadden, I think.
Yeah, President McFadden.
Thank you, Bill. Aaron. We're in agreement with the floor. I think that as we look at, kind of 3 years out from here, I think there are some deeper conversations to be had. I think Rick brings up a great point about really trying to set some aspirational goals for the state if we're going to look at FTE funding. I think that only looking within the state probably limits the impact of what we want to do on a national, if not a global perspective as it relates to higher ed in Kentucky. I am comfortable with some amount of the performance funds, that the new funds that would perhaps be distributed over the next 3 years being base budgeted into the institution's budget for the next year to provide some stability there. To have all of those funds kind of being wholly redistributed every year, I think makes it difficult for an institution to budget. The methodology of FTE versus using the performance metrics as they've currently been compromised, we could really go either way. And uniquely institutionally, we kind of find ourselves kind of square in the middle of this conversation around equity, around performance. And so, when we look at it, I think that this is a reasonable approach forward. I appreciate Senator Givens and Director Hicks and obviously Representative Tipton's feedback on this as we bring this to policymakers in what is going to be a short but very packed session. I think that the simpler we can keep this, and if we can keep everyone on the same page, the more successful we'll be in moving that through the policy process.
Thanks, President McFadden. Who else? Paul, have you spoken?
No, but I will now. And thank you for saying what you did about KCTCS. Anytime you're looking at FTEs, that typically is a disadvantage for community and technical colleges. That said, we're in support of the floor. The only comment I'll make is it seems like this is relatively new. And it seems like waiting 3 years to get back together to talk about it seems like a long time. I don't know what other people's thoughts are about that, but in general, KCTCS is in support.
Well, I will tell you, we don't have to wait. We don't need an order for us to get together and talk about this. After talking with several of our legislative members and even the administration, I think everybody wants to know, what does it look like? We understand that there are limitations to budgets. We get that. I promise you we do, as I say what I'm ready to say. I think all that I've talked to want to see higher education truly achieve at the levels that we can achieve. So I don't think they would actually mind at all if we looked at a way of thinking about, and by the way, CPE, one of the goals I had when I came in was, how do we make all our individual institutions so mission related? I mean, in other words, each of you have your powerhouse. How do we help you to build that powerhouse and not saying y'all look exactly alike, but not having those items that doesn't make you as unique as I argue that you need to be in this new economy that we have. So the idea of what you're suggesting, Paul, is something that we can conduct without any order from the legislature to do it. And it doesn't have to be around reviewing performance funding. It could be around actually how we achieve our mission related elements that we're assigned to achieve, and what it looks like to have some level of funding parity to make that happen.
Well, President Thompson, I think we've heard from all of the campus presidents. So perhaps Senator Givens, Representative Tipton, if you would like to make some comments.
This is Senator Givens, and I'd hoped that, Bill, it seems like every time that I turned my mute off, I got called on. So I purposely left my mute off. I left my mic open the entire time, hoping I would never be called on. And now you've still called on me. So I don't understand the operating precedents for this group. I've tried really hard to be a good group member. I've tried to avoid getting called on, and it doesn't seem to work.
That's what you get for showing up.
So Bill, I'm gonna take an easy start with a comment back on a question you raised as you went through the bullets, and a very appropriate question about that fourth or fifth bullet on the page where we had written in the potential for the work group to come back together in 2022 with a report due in December 1 of 2023. After talking with some of my LRC staff that have been monitoring and very helpful in this conversation, they suggested we think about, and Aaron, to your point, yes, we can be called back together anytime, but they suggested wisely, I think, for this group to start convening in 2022 to give us more time to have a work product ready December 1 of 2023. So that may be something we want to think about. We could have potentially hit and we haven't gotten over the hurdle yet, but we could have potentially hit a hurdle in this conversation that would have caused some real challenges time-wise. So that's a thought as it relates to that one. Because I'm getting old enough that synthesizing things in a really simple format seems to stick with me better, as I've listened to the conversation around not just the proposal, but the overall performance funding model and the intents and the goals. And I've really enjoyed listening, because what I'm starting to hear is that we're all acknowledging that this is an iterative improvement sort of approach. We're going to have to review this every 3 years or so to make certain that these minor adjustments need to be made. And in my mind, this is sort of a version 1.5. This is not a 2.0. We're not throwing out everything. We've got a lot of the very same important components in this proposal we're talking about, but I like the tone of iterative improvement, because this is never going to be a perfected product. It's going to have to be refined over time. Now, the conversation about the floor, the system, as I've taken some notes, that seems to strike me as working really well. And they all start with the letter P. I don't know why they do that, but they do. The floor approach is in my mind taking the shape of the word presence. So we have that investment in the floor that the state's going to make. As the proposal indicates, if this is what we stay with, it doesn't drop below that. It is the state acknowledging the presence of that institution and the value of that institution. And so the word presence as it relates to floor works well. We've long talked about performance, and so that P is pretty easy. The new money would be in that performance effort, and it would not impact the presence effort. The conversation that Rick led us through, and it was a good conversation. It's interesting to me. I need to learn more about how these other states look at FTE and what level they fund. The P word that fits there is peers in other states, and so that becomes part of it. Director Hicks made me think of another word, and this becomes really hard, but this is something that I think long-term we do need to talk about. I don't know that we have time now, but that other P word is potential. We need to think about a way to invest in the long-term potential of each of these institutions, separate from their short-term performance. And I realize that because we're smoothing it over a period of time, we're rewarding performance. It's not an immediate short-term reward, but it is a performance reward. But what potential does that institution have? Can we invest in that potential in some way separate from the immediate performance? When a KSU is rising as fast as they're rising, but they're still carrying some old baggage that keeps them from hitting the stride that gets them into the money. Is there and this would be a really good philosophical, almost theological kind of discussion about post-secondary education. when we talk about some sort of means to invest in the long-term potential. So I think that's a conversation we do need to have. I like the tone of where we're headed. I think President Cavoni's question about on a strictly pure FTE, I'd have to think about it some. I like that a bit, but if we start incentivizing FTE, are we doing actually a perverse incentive in some way to cause institutions to try and enroll students to drive up that FTE, to then shift monies into places where we're not rewarding performance as much as we are rewarding you getting folks in the door and them scoring an FTE? It's an interesting conversation. I do think any conversations around parity and equity are going to be conversations we're always going to be having, because as Bill indicated, of the 8, we had 6 that were there. Now we have 5 that are there, with 3 that are actually a bit out of parity in a sense of they're ahead on their money instead of behind on their money, unless you want to say the 5 are behind and 3 are any way you do it. But I think over time, we're going to see that continuing to be a component of the conversation. It's important it be. We may have to look, and I mentioned this to Bill in a phone conversation we had. Bill, every 3 years or so, we may have to look at what a base level, a floor level of funding looks like for each institution. That may be something that has to be reset every 3 years. I'm uncertain, but I think we got to continue striving to drive toward the goals of performance, because your all's results indicate how clearly this is incentivizing the kind of outcomes we need. Aaron keeps talking about 60 by 30. Every time I talk with groups about post-secondary education, I shout accolades about the work that's being done in moving toward this goal, this North Star that Aaron referred to. I think it's so important for our state and for us long-term to continue on the aggressive performance path that we're on. And so with that, I think I could be excited over the next couple of years of us having a conversation about potential.
What Senator Gibbons added one other element to this conversation, and if I interpreted it correctly, I like it. And that is, what does it look like for each institution to have the potential that it was originally designed to have, and that we've now reevaluated it for it to have? KSU will, although an HBCU may not be exactly the same HBCU it was in 1890 or even in 1960 or in 1980, but what's the potential that it has? What potential does it have in the area of teacher education or whatever? I'm just throwing stuff out. So the idea of talking about potential is, the way I hear it, Senator Gibbons, tell me if I'm wrong, is the idea of what opportunity do they have and what do they need to reach that opportunity toward the mission that we've designed to help them to truly live out their part of reaching that 60 by 30. I mean, I'm adding this in the way that I at least see the mission that we have at CPE to kind of drive that agenda.
Aaron, I think you're right. Aaron, I think you're right. And I'm going to interject very briefly. The part of it that makes a bit of a math, computer science guy uncomfortable is that this is a qualitative measure. What we're talking about here is more qualitative than it is quantitative. And so it would have to be done in a way that still is focused and a conversation that's not just nebulous about someone's potential. But yes, I think we've got to invest in what an institution can be, not just what it is today, not just what it's graduating today, that we can measure quantitatively those things. Qualitatively, how do we come up with something to say, this institution that serves this part of the state that's so vitally important to the future of the Commonwealth, it has the potential to be this, it's moving in that direction, we feel compelled to invest in that institution. But then 5 to 7 years down the road, if it's not still hitting the stride, we've got to have the backbone to say, no, you've squandered the opportunity. We invested in your potential. You didn't live into that potential. The funds are coming back. That's the part that's hard. But I think it's a qualitative conversation that needs to be had.
Yeah, and by the way, let me just be clear. I agree with you. I think it has to have quantitative metrics. It has to have those items. You can turn these qualitative discussions or mission-related discussions into some quantitative metrics.
Okay.
Do it all the time. So I agree with you. It's just not a nebulous conversation. It is about how do we achieve those things. I'll use KSU as an example with our management plan that we came up with several years ago with quantitative metrics and how they've reached those now, and they have fulfilled those for 2020. Anyway, I like that discussion. Also, what I heard, I just want to make sure that you're suggesting as a part of our proposal that we revisit the entirety of this, we revisit the performance funding work group evaluation process or assessment process in 2022. Did I hear that correctly?
I think it would be very appropriate to start that in 2022 with a recommendation deadline of December 1, 2023. And maybe the language would be the work group will reconvene at the call of CPE for a 3-year review recommendation to the General Assembly by the date. Maybe we don't even need to write in the date that we start back to work. CPE will have its finger on the pulse of all the institutions of the way the funding formula is working, of what's working, what's not, how robust will these conversations have to be. Maybe CPE can envision us doing it in 2 months and we don't need to convene until 2023. But if we just left it open with a recommendation date and give CPE the latitude to start when they want, we could start in 22 and finish in 23, or start in 23 and finish in 23. But I don't know that we want to say start in 23 and finish in 23, because that may be too constraining.
I want to throw this in. I'm going to open it up to Representative Tipton and John Hicks to throw their words in. But I will say that this could be several conversations, because I think several of them, I mean, if we talk about each of these pieces, I think sometimes you can get convoluted and not get a clear outcome on other items. I mean, an example are the metrics we're using in performance funding, maybe one conversation. As we look at what the floor is made up of, maybe another. So I would appreciate not having a start date, but possibly an end date that we can have stuff to you, because I would want to, based on what I think Paul and Ashish has offered, and start the conversations earlier rather than a particular time.
President Thompson, could I just clarify one thing with Senator Gibbons before we go to Representative Tipton and back to State Budget Director Hicks?
Sure.
I think what I heard you say, Senator Gibbons, is that along with your proposal for the general fund floor, that the General Assembly always, at their discretion, would have the option of resetting a new floor, which would then allow any funds that were earned by institutions in the performance fund distribution. It would allow the General Assembly to add those funds to the base of those institutions and reset a new floor. Perhaps instead of the floor 2021, it might be the floor 2023, and that is your response to State Budget Director Hicks saying it's about trying to move the institutions toward that funding parity. It's not necessarily about the general fund per FTE metric per se. Is that correct? The General Assembly, of course, always has the discretion to establish a new floor, but I thought I heard you say that that's an option that might address State Budget Director Hicks's proposal.
Bill, you ended with my opening, and my opening was going to be that the General Assembly is both blessed and cursed with the ability to do anything they want to do at any time they want, as long as they're in session, and whether it makes sense or not, we can do those things. So you sort of stole my thunder. I think a floor reset is something that's a component of the conversation, but I'm not overly anxious to see us run out and do that real quick. I don't know that I'm anxious to do that real quick. And here's my logic. And I did some back of the envelope math myself. And again, the only reason that I felt it was good for us to have a scenario in front of us was to make sure that we were all communicating clearly on how the money worked. I'm not putting this out there to indicate this is what the General Assembly will do. But that 20 million that we're talking about in the scenario for 22-23 bill. That 20 million divided into a base of 885 is 2.3%. I say that to say a 2.5% stop loss, if we talk about stop losses, which is something we've talked about for some time, that 20 million is a 2.3 and 885. So I'm not going to be real quick to say we need to reset the floor, because it's money that does matter. 20 million does matter, but 20 is only 2.3. If you go all the way out to 60 over 925, you're at a 6.5% stop loss. So even if we cooked it in to somebody's base, and then we said, oh, by the way, we're gonna let you know you've got these monies, but we're going to impose on you a 6.5% stop loss, you're, in my mind, effectively doing the same thing, of whether you let the money flow back into the formula every time, or you cook it in the base and then you draw some out of the base. I'm going to be a proponent for the next 3 years that we stay with what we have. But I think Director Hicks is on to something that's worth considerable discussion over the next 3 years. Until we bring people up to parity, the playing field doesn't give everyone a chance to earn those monies. And that's part of what I think I'm hearing him say as well. And so, but for purposes of this discussion, keeping us on the same page we left the other day, I'm going to say no plans right now to reset the floor without us taking another look as a work group about the ramifications of that, because every change has a ripple effect on other pieces.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Budget Director Hicks, you want to jump in here?
No, sure. No, I just, first I want to say that the floor idea, I'm completely supportive of. It addresses a number of issues. So that is a good idea, fully supportive of that. And appreciate the larger conversations of, I've had the unfortunate benefit of living through at least 3 or 4 post-secondary ed funding formulas in my career, going back to the early 80s. And a lot of the things that you all, the presidents, have talked about are very thoughtful and things that have been considered. Benchmark funding was one of the funding proposals, the formulas we used to have. But anyway, in that regard, I'm completely supportive of the ground floor. I appreciate you all, the reactions and some of the commentary on how we can improve the prospect of rewarding, good behavior for all institutions, and that was the kind of the point of my thoughts on the adjustment. I recognize that it is not a fully formed quantitative idea, but in any case, just wanted to make the point while we had the opportunity at our last meeting to say there are some things that still need to be improved, and that we really didn't want to wait on 50 to 100 million to have some of the institutions benefit from the model.
Representative Tipton, I don't see you on my screen, so I don't know if you're there or not. If so, I will ask you to jump in and say a word or two.
He is not with us today.
Okay. So folks, we are at a crucial time. We basically have a couple of things on the table. I've heard everybody agree on most of those items. Once again, I don't know if everybody's going to agree on everything. It is about consensus about what we can live with. And I'm going to try to kind of lay out 2 items for us to look at and vote on. I'll lay out the first one first with a caveat, and then we'll open it up for discussion at that point in time. Basically, the first item to think about as a proposal is the original item without the addendum, but with a 2022 review process that would take into account a variety of items yet to be determined around the performance funding model, but also items that we look at that involves the floor and the definition of what the floor is. So if someone wants to, but we're basically what you're reading in front of you without the red. It's what I'm proposing with the item of review of 2022 and having CPE to have the ability to define some of that review process around this, I think is kind of the way Senator Givens said in a reasonable way. Am I voicing, Senator Givens, what I heard you say as a proposal?
Aaron, I think you are. I certainly do think you are. And I'm glad you called back on me for a moment because I want to clarify something you're going to see me do in just a few moments. Years ago, in a task force work group that I was appointed to by then Senate President David Williams, we were coming down to the final stages, and it became clear through conversations with President Williams and others, a legislator on a task force and voting on a proposal is something that it's not the wisest thing in the world to do, because then you end up going on the floor of the body that you represent and you have to take a position and you constrain yourself in some ways. And so even though my name has been attached in some fashion to this proposal, and I'm very, very supportive of the proposal, you will not see me voting yes or no. Aaron, when you call my name, I'm not going to vote yes or no. So be prepared for that. And don't be disappointed if that's the case.
I won't be disappointed. I guess I should clarify what we're voting on. What we're voting on is truly the conclusion of the group that we have come to have some consensus around that we will present to the legislature, who in fact can take it and do anything that they want to do with it. But I think they are anxious to hear what we have to say. I have full belief they've asked us to do this with good intent. If Senator Givens, whether he votes on it or not, I know his intention is that this is when we originally put this in place, that they are wanting to hear what we have to say. So any questions over what the first vote is about? And we'll have one more vote after this on another that adds in the red piece of the addendum.
That would be my question, Dr. Thompson, is when you mentioned that there would be other items that could be discussed in the 2022 review process, could Budget Director Hicks's proposal be indicated or flagged as something that would be incorporated into that, which would then allow time for us to see how it was working without it, I guess, you know, and then to have the option to reintroduce it in light of a context and in light of some measurable outcomes based on what has already been presented, or we've already experienced, I guess would be the way to say it.
Not only can that be done, we'll make sure it's highlighted in the write-up that we offer to the General Assembly, as a matter of fact, yes.
Okay, all right. Because to me, that would be sort of the compromise position, is if we say in what we do that we intend to revisit that with specific metrics or specific thoughts in mind based on what we've talked about, then it would be a win-win for all of us to have a more comprehensive way of thinking about what we were looking for when we assessed our experience with it, the first proposal or the floor proposal.
I think that's a good caveat, Beverly, to be honest with you. I think that's a good and fair caveat. Absolutely, we'll include that. And so we're talking about the first proposal with a 2022 review, with particularly calling out the red piece of the addendum, if you will, as what we would recommend that would be thoroughly reviewed in the next go around. So yes.
Aaron, if I may, just to pick up on something that Beverly just mentioned, and I think that might be a good approach. Also taking into consideration the very thoughtful comments I've heard around the table, including Senator Givens just most recently. Perhaps there is no real necessity for a second proposal then. What I'm hearing is that we have the core proposal of the general fund floor approach, and the additional what we would just say are open items for review by the working group as appropriate. I really liked what Senator Givens said about the General Assembly being both blessed and cursed, which means, of course, that they can revisit those depending upon our analysis and approach. And I would put those open items as ones that, things, for instance, the question about state investment.
Yes.
You can call it whatever you want, parity or an indicator of state investment. You can talk about non-resident. You can talk about mission differentiation. Those are some elements that we don't have the time, frankly, the energy to do all that right away. I've certainly made that clear over time. But those then are good caveats of things we should keep in mind, including the approach of saying those are things that would be revisited in 2022 or earlier, as the case may be.
Well, Ashish, I'm happy to go in that direction, actually. I would prefer to do that if everybody agrees with that. I think it's cleaner, it's simpler. Since Director Hicks actually brought this to the table, and there's been a couple of you to agree with that, I will see if he's willing to think about that as a friendly amendment or if he wants a full vote out on the other.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. No, I'm agreeable to that approach. I recognize we're at the 11th hour here on the work group, and this is a meaty issue, that needs the appropriate consideration. Happy to just bring it to further light, but agreeable to that approach.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else want to comment on that approach before I make a formal recommendation that we can vote on? Bob Jackson, convener of the presidents, what do you think?
No, I agree with everything that's been said, and I support the proposal as stated earlier. I support the performance funding model, and I support what has been said. The last caveat that I would add, since we're taking that approach, is I do think it would be helpful in 2022 to look at our peer group and aspirational peers. And it gets into what Senator Givens said in regard to, what would we like to be and hope to be? What is our mission? What should we be looking at? I think it would serve us well to look at those different groups, current peers, aspirational peers, and really where we stand. We're all very different institutions in different parts of the state with different missions. And I think that would be helpful. But I would move that we advance the proposal as submitted.
Thank you, Bob. I will tell you, just as I said earlier, we are going to be having some mission-related conversations because that's popped up in more ways than one during this time. We've been talking about it for a while, obviously, but I appreciate and hear what you're saying with that statement, and I think it goes to exactly the kind of conversations that's healthy. So unless someone else has something to say, Eli, I noticed you went off mute. Did you want to say something, sir?
No, I just want to clarify what we're, quote, voting on. Because you've appreciated what people have said, and I thought we started with really indicating support for the first part of this.
Right.
And then not necessarily as part of that vote, a recognition that everything's discussable, certain things that we've talked about today, definition of parity versus equity. I look at the first bullet and say the current formula freezes out or limits certain institutions. I'd say the current formula without new funds. So there's much to discuss there. And I'm curious, after listening to this discussion, we tend to focus on our mission, and I think that's important. And we want to compare to peers, especially in terms of sort of funding. But I think the bigger question, which really brought us to performance funding, is what is the Commonwealth's interest and perspective? I mean, do we want to be benchmark with our peers, or do we want to create a sort of more prosperous Kentucky, and how do we get there? sometimes those aren't in full alignment if you benchmark to peers. You know, which I can say if we benchmark to peers, we're going to look like we're at a disadvantage. You know, all of us will in a certain way. I just don't want to lose sight of, you know, what was a strong calling card when I came here 10 years ago, and that was stronger by degrees.
Right. And we are still doing that. And I think Eli hits a point that I will put in this write-up and we'll share with you all. I think right now, though, I think it's in recognition that we would have a lot of those discussions before 2023. I think as Eli's what we're saying, we're not having those discussions now, but he brings one point that I'm going to be very honest about that I've said already multiple times. I think we have to, no matter what the review looks like between now and then, it has to take in consideration how we make Kentucky a stronger Kentucky. I mean, and that's this, once again, 60 by 30 marker that has a lot of interplay with each of you and what you stand for with your institutions, as well as the responsibility that the administration and the legislature has been a part of this overall way of making this happen. So I hear you, Eli, and basically what we're offering to vote on now is the proposal as it is, with the statement that we'll come back in 2022 and discuss a variety of items that make Kentucky stronger, with the specifically, as Beverly pointed out, the items that was mentioned in John's addendum. But that's not what we're voting on. We're voting on now exactly the floor, what the proposal that you're seeing in front of you, and how that looks like it. The only caveat is the review process that we'll do between now and the 3 years that will be up in 2023. Does all this make sense to everybody?
Yeah, I guess technically, since there was a motion on the floor going back, that we would consider what I brought up a friendly amendment.
It wasn't a formal motion.
No.
But I mean, it wasn't a formal motion at that time. Yeah, so it was a formal. It was an informal way to make sure we had all the language down before we take it.
Right, but just to put it in a frame, I mean, it's like that would be more like a friendly amendment that we include designation of the open items as discussed. So going back to President Capilouto's question, what are we actually voting on? The proposal and the friendly amendment then.
That's exactly right. And so without me over talking this, all in favor of this, say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Any nays? Any abstentions? Hearing none, this is the proposal that we will write up and take. We will send it out to you. Bill, you have all this information, right?
Yeah, yes, that's correct. And you're bringing us to the next item on the agenda, which is the next steps. Me and my staff have been working on a draft report that summarizes, what has taken place at the past 4 or 5 meetings of this working group. And we'll write up what has transpired today with the general fund floor proposal in the way of recommendations. And we probably need about at least a week to 10 days to wrap up that draft report with those recommendations. We can send out the recommendations page separately before then, but in terms of the recommendations being included with a draft report, we would like to send that out mid-December and get responses back from work group members for suggested changes so that we can get those made and finalize a report prior to January 1.
Any questions over next steps? Any more comments or questions before we bring to an end this meeting and this performance funding review work group? First of all, I want to say thank you all. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving. I really appreciate the camaraderie, the collegiality, the way that we've done business. This is why we are doing what we're doing in higher education in this state. I have to tell you, I get a chance, as Ashish knows, to really talk to a lot of folk around the country who are in my positions and positions of system heads. And Kentucky is looked upon as enviable the way we conduct our business in higher ed, as well as how we connect with P12. That's something to be proud of. And this is a good example. We know that each one of you are bringing to the table your own needs, wants, desires to help you do the best you can do for the students that you serve. We get that. But bringing this process together with the collegiality that we have shown goes to the understanding that we're serving a bigger need, and that's our state and the overall population of the state. So I want to appreciate at least every chance I get to be a part of this conversation and to be a part of the team. So I thank you. I hope you have a good holiday. I hope you guys have more success. I know we'll be talking a lot before Christmas and obviously a lot after Christmas. And so I just want to personally thank you and for allowing me to be of some service to what you do. Any last statement before we actually end early? Have a good one, folks.
Thanks.
Be safe.
You too. Thank you.